Welcome. I am Dr. Mujtaba Moharrer, co-organizer of the Mobility Roundtable, based at the Scapin's Eye Research Institute, Mass Eye Year of Harvard Medical School. I will be starting the roundtable and introducing the speakers, and my colleague, Dr. Andrew Thomason from the University of Leeds in the UK, will guide the Q&A and will close the session. Mobility and ethics. Do we have a say? Ethics in mobility is not a new concern. However, with technological advancement, it has become of more critical importance. But do we have a say when it comes to ethics in mobility, especially when our concerns seem to be contradicting growth? Can we find the balance between growth and the long-term well-being of the individuals in society, particularly more vulnerable populations? Today's guests are Professor Francine Berman, Mr. Tim Dawkins, and Dr. Linnet Taylor. We're going to jump right in with our first speaker, Professor Francine Berman. Professor Francine Berman is the Edward P. Hamilton Distinguished Professor of Computer Science at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and was selected as the 2019-2020 Catherine Hamsel Bessel Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies at Harvard University. Welcome, Fran. Please start.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited on the conversation that we're going to have today. I guess I just want to talk about the world we're living in. And for some time, we've been living in a world driven by a tremendous set of connected technologies. We've seen amazing devices, cars that can almost drive all by themselves, connected implantable medical devices, smartphones, smart farms, Fitbits, Alexas, wherever you look, there are connected devices and systems that are trying to create greater efficiencies and optimize the world around us. And in fact, they've become critical infrastructure. So those of you that are either instructors or students may find that the only way you can do your job now is to be online. This is the only way we can have this roundtable, is to be online, and that's brought to us by connected technologies. At the same time, this technology innovation puts us at risk. Self-driving cars crash, baby monitors are not secure, our data is not private, even in our cars, and surveillance has really become a constant in our modern lives. So, are all of these technologies, these connected technologies and innovations moving us towards a utopia or a dystopia? And my own feeling is that the answer is that it's really up to us. It's how we regulate these devices, how we design them, how we build them, how we use them, how we manage the innovation and growth. And all of these can be kind of tuned to promote either benefits or risks. And I think it's up to us to make those decisions. So last year I was a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard studying the social, environmental, and ethical implications of Internet of Things devices. And in particular, one of my favorite Internet of Things devices, and I say almost self-driving cars because we're not exactly there yet, but I'll just call it self-driving cars. And this is an amazing technology. It's amazing in the way it's being developed, and it's amazing that by 2050, many expect self-driving cars to be ubiquitous. You won't be able to buy cars that aren't self-driving anymore, and we expect that almost all cars on the road, if not all, will be self-driving. So the question I wanted to explore was, what would we do if here in 2020 we wanted to develop self-driving cars in the public interest? How do we get to the public interest so it benefits society? What are the social and ethical and economic and lifestyle and environmental implications? And what are the trade-offs that we are likely to deal with? And so and I had some great Harvard undergrads working with me. So this is a shout out to the Radcliffe program. What my students and I learned is there are very far-reaching implications of new technologies and new innovations like the ones used in self-driving cars. So let me just talk about a few of them. Environmental implications. We've thought a lot for a long time about the environmental implications of automobiles But, you know, with self-driving cars, we don't just need to think about emission reduction and electric cars. We need to think about e-waste. We need to think about the potential for resource depletion. When you think about all the computers and all of the data that has to be processed in a car, you're probably talking about more use of rare earth. You're talking about use of lithium and the alternatives for the batteries, et cetera. So it really changes our thoughts about the birth, life cycle, and death of these cars with respect to environmental sustainability. It also changes the built environments. In most of our cities, about 30% of the land use is parking. And you talk about parking on the street, underground, overground, et cetera. And with self-driving cars, you may not need parking at all. You know, maybe they're a service and they just pick somebody else up next, or they can park a very long way away. We'll have perhaps longer commutes because, the same commute can be a longer distance, and we can be doing something else in the car. So there are a lot of implications both to the built environment and the natural environment. In social implications, of course, it's a big topic for the community and how we get these cars to drive ethically. And it's not just a matter of getting the same guidelines. You know, if I had my druthers, I would like my self-driving car to drive with exactly my ethics. So even though the trolley problem is a little simplistic, if you give me the choice of, you know, kill a few people or kill a lot of people, if my children are in those few people, I might have a very different answer about that than somebody else might. So, you know, it's what ethics, whose ethics, how many ethics, and then there is who's responsible for the outcomes of this, who's liable for it. How does it change mobility? You know, I can't have my car, if I had small children, you know, I couldn't have my car take my children to daycare without an adult in the car, but I can in the future. And so, you know, how does that change things? So there are many social implications. There are economic implications. So when you think about 2050, will we be owning our own cars, or will we just use them as a service? I want to go somewhere, I dial it up, the car appears, I leave it off, then I go take some other car when I want to go back home. And when we change the economics of whether we have car ownership or car as a service, you know, what becomes more prevalent? What does that do to public transportation? Does it become privatized like air transportation is these days, et cetera? And then lastly, we thought about, and there are many more implications, lifestyle implications. So when I don't have to spend my commuting time actually driving, what could I do? Could I have a conference call? Could I have a meal? Could I go to sleep? Could I watch a movie? So there's lots of other things to do. And it will depend, our lifestyles will depend. So the fascinating thing to me is that each of these areas of impact can enable or deter the others. So there'll be lots of trade-offs and interdependencies and inconsistencies. So if I make lighter, more environmentally friendly self-driving cars, and that promotes sustainability, that means that perhaps I'm jettisoning safety equipment. And I'm potentially increasing the severity of accidents when I do have them. So there are trade-offs, you know, is it more sustainable, or am I more likely to be safe in the car in that particular instance? And those kinds of things we're going to have to take into consideration when we go to the public interest. So finally, the bottom line is what? You know, how do we develop these things in the next 30 years so they really support the public interest? And it turns out that each sector has a role. The public sector has a role to kind of come up with the kind of public and environmentally focused law and policy and practice that we need. And the private sector very much has to start looking at public interest focused design and incorporation of protections so that my car is private enough, et cetera. And then the public really needs to be aware of these issues because we will be asked to weigh in on them, including to vote for people who will have opinions on them. And that will be really important. So hopefully I didn't go over my time, and I'm eager to hear what the other panelists say.
Perfect. Thank you, Fran. It was perfect. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Tim Dawkins. Mr. Tim Dawkins is the project lead of automation and autonomous mobility at the World Economic Forum. He is responsible for a portfolio of research and advisory projects in the area of automated driving and vehicle safety as a part of the forum's platform for shaping the future of mobility. He's also specialized in a range of automotive technology, including ADAS, autonomous vehicles, and vehicle security. Welcome, Tim. Please.
Thanks very much, Mujtaba. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. And yeah, I think I will hopefully give you a little bit of perspective for how things are running on the industry side and how they're progressing forward. So the mission of our platform here at the forum is to deliver a future of mobility which is clean, safe, and inclusive. And when thinking about the ethics of future mobility systems, not just automated vehicles, although I will kind of go down that rabbit hole in a minute, we want the ethical implications kind of span all of those dimensions, as Fran very eloquently put just before me. So first and foremost, when we talk about road safety, thinking about the future of mobility is we have to ensure that automated vehicles, if they are a large part of mobility ecosystems, must demonstrate a positive risk balance if they are to be successful. And what I mean by that is they must demonstrate relative safety compared to human drivers, at least, to be considered a broad societal benefit. Then, of course, we have to think about creating an ethical service in itself. So in terms of privacy, in terms of data, in terms of accessibility, in terms of inclusivity and access to all, and in terms of explainability, which is a really key question that I want to drill into in a second. And then the third dimension that we really see is responsibility. I want to kind of caution anybody that has grand aspersions with regard to autonomous vehicles that they will not be perfect, and there will be circumstances that they will crash. And when it goes wrong, what happens? Who should be liable for paying compensation following a collision? How do we ensure that all stakeholders involved in the delivery of such services are willing and able and motivated to take responsibility, and generally create a culture of responsibility around connected and automated vehicles as they're deployed? Now, that's not all to be negative about these things. There are lots of opportunities here for both industry and policymakers to step up. In terms of road safety, the opportunities start with safety by design. We want to bake in, beyond engineering and the development of the hardware and the software, we want to bake in ethical practices throughout the service design and deployment of these vehicles and create a lasting safety culture. And those are two words that are extremely important in the industry here. Move fast and break things does not work in this sector. We need to prevent misuse of these technologies. As Fran mentioned, many of the first experiences that a lot of you will have with these systems will be partially automated driver assistance systems. So we need to prevent misuse. Never underestimate the creativity of the end user to misuse or overtrust your systems. We also need to consider how our traffic rules can be modified, or exceptions for non-compliance where it's the right thing to do. Traffic rules are in themselves not and they're a means, not an end, with regards to road safety. Think of the example of when you might mount a curb to allow an emergency vehicle to come through. That is something that is not allowed in road traffic law, but is actually the right thing to do. So in terms of the second dimension, that kind of ethical and equitable service offerings, we need to think about where we have opportunities to redress inequalities in existing mobility services through the deployment of new mobility solutions, by incentivizing deployment to underserved communities to augment public transport rather than replacing it. We also need to pursue generally solutions for the many and not the few. Those of you who might have seen Westworld or other recent sci-fi dramas, we don't want to create a future of mobility where the rich and the powerful fly above us in their private quadcopters and the unwashed masses are left kind of scurrying around on the streets. And equally, kind of building on that, we need to prevent discriminatory service provision and not reinforce or exacerbate any social inequalities there. And then finally, safeguarding user privacy. Automated and connected vehicles will have the potential to collect a lot of data about their users, whether that's the way that you're authenticated to use the service, in-cabin monitoring, or even just collecting data about your movement. We need to go above and beyond to protect user privacy when we have so much intimate information about how people move around. That means going beyond the kind of take it or leave it models of consent that we have today to move towards agile and continuous consent options, a sliding scale, if you will. And then the final dimension of transparency and responsibility. We need measures that consider how to protect passengers versus pedestrians and other road users separately from how we assign culpability to the service provider or the vehicle manufacturer in the event that something does go wrong. Within that, we need to define accountability and clarity and explainability, using a lot of large words there, but understanding the obligation to explain what happens when something goes wrong and how that came to pass is critical to accepting these technologies and ensuring that they can be improved on going forward. And then to kind of put a bow on all of that, it does come back to the public sector. We need a policy and legal environment that creates a fair and transparent culpability process in terms of that liability, but also, again, makes considerations for user privacy, equitable service, and improving road safety as we go forward. The industry has a lot to do as well. It's not just all on the policymakers to create that by law. There's a lot of opportunity to demonstrate responsible innovation and technology leadership. And public engagement, as Fran mentioned, is also critical as these technologies are developed and deployed so that people can understand them, come to terms with them themselves and understand the kind of risks and trade-offs that are associated with these technologies. So that's my spiel. Thanks again for listening and looking forward to hearing the discussion going forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. It was great. Our third and final speaker is Dr. Linnet Taylor. Dr. Linnet Taylor is Associate Professor at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society, and is the leader of the Global Data Justice Project, seeking to understand the different perspectives worldwide on what constitutes just treatment through data technology. Dr. Taylor's research focuses on the use of new sources of digital data in governance and research around issues of human and economic development. And it's great to have you. Please, Doctor.
Thanks very much. I'm trying to figure out how I fit into this discussion because I'm interested in the broader landscape of transport provision, and really it's interesting the discussion so far is about cars, because in the US transport means cars, right? And this discussion is based in the US, but really in most places in the world, most people don't travel in cars most of the time, right? They use public transport. And cars are increasingly being crowbarred into public transport, into that landscape of provision, mainly because producing them is highly profitable on a unit basis, and because you can fill gaps in public transport with private provision of car-based transport. Whether that's a desirable thing or not is something we should think about. So if we're thinking of the global picture, we need to think about how cars fit with other forms of transport. So what is this landscape into which they fit? Well, it's one in which public infrastructure and services are increasingly getting privatized. Can we trust companies? When you invited me to think about this topic, you asked me to think about companies like Google, Tesla, and Uber as providers of transport. Now, this is interesting. Can we trust companies to be reliable and effective in providing transport? Of course we can. Can we trust them to justify what they do according to principles of public service and efficiency? Absolutely. So why might we not want them running public transport completely? Why don't we just turn all public transport into individual car services? Well, there's an important distinction here, I think, between contracting for public service provision and companies taking over things in the public sphere, in the public sector. Once we start talking about models that are radically different from existing public service provision models, we're talking about doing something we can't really undo, and having infrastructures be permanently privatized. We might want to think twice about that, because the systems that we're talking about here, for instance, sidewalk labs from Google, various urban transport systems, which do include cars alongside other forms of public transport, and which are very much data-driven and efficiency-driven, are based on a logic of optimization. And they will always optimize for something, right? So if they're coming from big tech, that business model is based on exponential growth, not public service. So even if the makers of cars, buses, trains, I don't mind what we're focusing on here, justify this with their interest in producing a more efficient public transport system, they mean something different by efficiency than the rest of us do. They're fundamentally going to be implementing infrastructures that are multi-purpose, where they want to learn from a given implementation to expand and create different implementations. It's the opposite of the way the public sector operates, which is to concentrate on one area over a long period of time, usually hundreds of years, and to develop serious expertise and a universally accessible and equal system. So firms will optimize for profit, which is the opposite of the public sector. And when it comes to public goods, like a functioning public transport sector, it's worth thinking about whether introducing market-based motives and practices are going to strengthen or destroy the public good of a functioning transport sector. There's a lot of things that we want to intuitively preserve from becoming market-driven. They include things like healthcare, education, the justice system, electoral processes. A lot of people would argue public transport is another of those things. Also, if private companies do it, will we ever know what their business model is? We know from, for instance, the work of Virginia Eubanks, she wrote a wonderful book called Automating Inequality, that when you apply data-driven systems from the private sector in healthcare, you cause massive injustice and dysfunction. I can't imagine that whenever they encounter disadvantage and disempowerment in society, I can't imagine that transport would be any different. Second, there's an issue of basic functionality. If we look at, for instance, the example I mentioned earlier of Google's Alphabet's Sidewalk Labs, it's a self-contained system for managing public transport in the city. It doesn't feed information back into the city in any meaningful way. Any deficit in the transport system is immediately filled by partner firms like Uber, who again provide units of transport for individuals rather than transport for everybody. So you feed Uber in whenever the bus stop has too many people in a line, or whenever a bus or a train breaks down. So if the system goes wrong, how it's been working is proprietary, and the city never gets, or the country never gets to find out what the deficit was and fix it. The history disappears, the data necessary to reconstruct or fix the system is no longer in the public domain. And so you're permanently contracting out all forms of transport to a company whose interest is not the public's interest. Third, there's the issue of privacy, which you also invited me to think about. Mobility data that stems from everybody's movement, from when we carry around connected devices with us, when we ride connected bicycles or motorbikes, when we drive connected cars. This is the most sensitive data available on the planet. It's as sensitive as private health data. It can tell you both about individuals and groups. It tells you about income, occupation, health status, relationship status, social networks, who's doing business with whom, who worships with whom, who's gone to political demonstrations with whom, and where they went afterwards and where they came from initially. It tells you about almost every protected characteristic under the sun. And the idea that this could become open data and can feed directly back into these systems to improve performance is very complicated and problematic. Thank you. So what we encounter here is a justice problem, I guess, where access to sort of big data and using tools like AI to create equitable and just systems, it doesn't really seem there's any such thing right now in the system that we have, because companies produce profit and public transport produces transport, and these things don't really meet. Big data and AI will produce results in line with any injustice or inequality that already exists. This is how they function. They have nothing to go on but the past. So I think the terminology of technology and innovation acceptance may not be our friend here. Instead, we might want to think about technological democracy and technological citizenship, and how to translate the needs of the public into the provisions made by the system. And data-driven systems can be our friend there, and private profit-driven systems may have a place to belong and a role to play. But unless, they can't be standalone systems. They have no value in and of themselves unless they're driven by public demand. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Beautiful. Perfect. Thanks a lot. So before I ask our questions, I invite the speakers, if they'd like to discuss, a point was raised, or if they would like to have a conversation between themselves, please, Tim, Fran, Linnet, feel free to ask the other two speakers.
Linnet, I think I have a question for you there. Do you see opportunities that data can be used to improve the inclusivity of those dimensions?
Is it not already? Is this not how public transport already functions?
Well, can we be doing more? Can we be setting metrics and looking for KPIs to improve the accessibility?
Sure. It depends who the we is. I mean, data-driven, the insertion of data-driven provision into public transport systems has so far not lived up to its promise, shall we just say. If we look at particularly the developing world, you have to make contracts that are very clever to make sure that the public sector gets to see any of the data the private sector produces. And all of the technologies that you and Fran are talking about are developed and run by the private sector, and the data feeds into the private sector exclusively. There's no reason the public sector would ever have access to any of that data. So for that data to actually flow into reforming provision, into making things more efficient on a general level, rather than making profit more available to the individual providing company, we'd need to reform the way that the private and public sector interact. I would be very much in favor of that. I like technology, I like efficiency, I like being able to catch an Uber sometimes, it's fine. But I don't like the idea that Uber will take over from the bus, because most people need buses more than they need Ubers.
Thank you. So it was based on what we discussed, what, all three of you, what do you think is a practical research question? Something that goes beyond the theoretical conversation. What is it that we can do? What can we research that has practical implications? If Fran would like to start, it would be great.
I just unmuted myself. Well, I was thinking as Linnet and Tim were talking that the economics and sort of the cultural ecosystem in which the public versus private questions live is really interesting, and will evolve in really interesting ways. And there's kind of two threads that are particularly interesting to me. I think with the rise of self-driving car technologies, you're kind of seeing now new players in the room. So from the traditional automotive manufacturers, they're interested in developing efficient and safe and profitable cars. I think from the, and they have been the dominant people when you think about, the automotive industry. But in some sense, from a software perspective, from the Ubers of the world and the Waymos and, and all of the rest of this group, the car is the hardware. And the really interesting part is the software and the algorithms and the data collection and how you actually make it drive well. And, I think as we all know, this is like an extremely challenging thing. I mean, today, the average almost self-driving car has about 100 million lines of code. An airplane has like 6.5 million lines of code, because cars run into, literally and not, they have to interact with other kinds of objects all the time, much more frequently than planes, who have to deal with weather and other objects as well, but really not at the same level. And these are not even cars that are perfect. So you have to think about kind of the big fight in a way. Who will prevail? Software companies or automotive companies, or will there be some sort of interesting hybridization of the companies that end up developing these cars? And then there's the sense about the public versus private issues, which has a big impact on the economy. And I think that some of the things Linnet was talking about were really important. But for myself, I think when you think about, typically the public sector is not developing transportation, it's operating transportation. And that's really different, because right now we're both in a development and an operation phase. As we develop things that become more and more prevalent. And what the good economic and ethical and social models are, whether we privatize them, whether in some sense after they're developed to a certain level of adequacy, the public sector takes over. I don't know, I'd be really interested in everyone else's point of view, but I do think there are some big themes going on. And to harmonize them so it all happens in the public interest, which I would love to see over the next 30 years, is going to be really a challenge.
Thank you, Fran. Tim, if you'd like to. add to what do you think is a practical research question that we should focus on?
Having not done my PhD yet, I don't want to give away all my secret sauce, but yes, I think to build on what Fran was saying, one of the questions that we've encountered is a lot of public transport operators. So think about, I don't know, Transport for London as a good well-known example of that, or SFMTA, or pick your relative city transport provider. One day they will be customers of potentially highly automated vehicles that they will say, if you imagine, they might be looking to buy autonomous buses from I don't know, Waymo, or they might buy a piece of hardware from someone like Mercedes or Daimler, and then put on that software from another provider. So we need to be actively thinking about how we prevent monopolies from evolving in those service provisions. So if there's, at the moment, what we're seeing is a bit of an arms race in terms of autonomous vehicle software development. The hardware development is somewhat less competitive, but still a very important part of the industry. And what we could imagine is that one day there will only be one or two providers that might be able to provide the full stack in terms of hardware and software together. Now, what I think the service providers might prefer would be that they can buy a vehicle from someone and then buy software to run it separately and bid those out separately. And that imagines a future where either we've commoditized the hardware or the software, or perhaps both. But there's lots of complexity into how that contract bid process will evolve, and how do they ensure liability across both of those, and how do they make sure they've got the best solution for their city. So that's a really interesting area that we're just beginning to kind of surface as an idea, even before the solutions are really in the market. And then I think, to my earlier remarks, the questions of culpability and responsibility. Again, how do we assign that across hardware versus software providers? What happens when it goes wrong? There's only really been one big investigation, and that was, of course, the Uber fatality, that kind of delved into what went wrong from a software provision standpoint, what went wrong from a hardware standpoint, and all of the other failures that contributed to that unfortunate death. But there needs to be a lot more understanding of how we break that down, and how we do that kind of analysis going forward. So those are two areas that I see.
Thank you. Linnet, please.
Thanks. I mean, I think I come from a different disciplinary background, so my research questions sound a little different. But I'm super interested in the idea of the smart enough city, which comes from a researcher called Ben Green over with you at Harvard. What would smart enough transport systems look like? How can we tell when we start serving the private sector rather than the private sector serving us in transport provision? How would we define the threshold? And what role does data and tech play in that? Not with the idea that we need less tech necessarily, but what kind of tech actually serves public needs as opposed to private sector needs? I would say this is really important in thinking about how the US has arrived at a point where cars are the only viable form of transport, which was not necessary. And historically, a lot of political and economic work has gone into making cars the focus of attention. And this happened because of rhetoric and efforts that have been very, very conscious. So, and we see that in other parts of the world, the conversation has taken a very different direction. And so I guess it's useful to sort of historicize this and ask what lessons we can learn from places that have wound up so dependent on vehicles, on individual transport vehicles, that they don't have any other options.
Thank you. That was great. So to build on your question and hearing the responses, I want to ask, what is the role of, do we have a global ethics, or you mentioned the difference between the US, for example, and Europe in terms of mobility. Many cities are structured in a way that really your life depends on owning private cars, so that may shape the way the attitude and the mindset is about mobility overall. Does it mean that we should have, this is a small example, but we don't have a global standards for ethics? if you want to expand that, or do we have localized standards, or does it mean we really need to change the way we approach the challenge? If Fran, would you like to start?
I will, and I just want to say, Linnet, that in my own way and in my own work, I really agree with this notion that technology should empower people and people should just not enable technology. And I think that's some of the challenges we have across the board, not just technology, but with privacy, with how we want to adjudicate the internet, with how we want to use these devices, with how we want to make them secure. And I do think when one lets innovation, lead rather than kind of public interest lead, you get a really different answer to those questions. Okay, back to your question. I just think it's really interesting. There was a study which perhaps many of you already know about called the Moral Machine Project at MIT. And it was a fascinating study which they kind of invited people from all over the world to take the trolley problem test. So your self-driving car can kill more people or fewer people. They can kill law-abiding people, or they can kill law-breaking people. They can kill women, or they can kill men. They can kill young, or they can kill old. They had about 10 different questions. And to be fair, none of these questions are modulated. None of these questions are, my children, or the person I hate, or, there wasn't any modulation, which of course there generally is. So it was an interesting, albeit simplistic, a test. But the interesting thing is that they got millions of people responding to it. And the metadata they collected on, where the IP addresses were and stuff like that allowed them to really coarsely group the ethical approaches that people had. And at least for this data and this sample of, 3 or 4 million volunteer people from all over the world, the answer was that national jurisdiction makes a difference. That we have, they imply that we have some sort of cultural ethics. So if you live in a very collective society where public good is, approached in a particular way, and you're going to have different answers than if you're in a really individualistic society. And if you live in a society where you trust the government versus in a society where you don't trust the government, you'll get really different answers. And for them, they got sort of 3 areas of the world that had kind of what you might say different cultural ethics, culturally influenced ethics. And for me, even though it, it isn't like completely a representative sample, et cetera, it does, to me, reinforce the idea that ethics are relatively relative. And we may not get to a global ethical system that everybody, agrees the same thing about. And that when we get down to these Internet of Things devices like cars that have to make autonomous decisions that could potentially be hurtful for people, we might consider different approaches, which I think is a tremendous research question, by the way.
Thank you, Fran. Tim, do you like to?
Yeah, I don't know that I can give quite such an in-depth answer, but one of the ideas that we champion here at the forum is that mobility is a human right, and this is something that not everybody agrees on if you really push them on it. Particularly here in the US, you see that idea kind of get a little bit of pushback every once in a while. But again, mobility is a human right. It has direct links to your economic prosperity, your health, your general well-being, where you can go, what jobs you can access, all of this, whether you can get to your doctor's appointment. So if we take that as, well, if we take that to be self-evident, to paraphrase, then should we not look at mobility services as a form of public good? And then that, again, if we take that as a given, the onus becomes on the regulator to have an obligation to allocate that public good in an equitable fashion that is inclusive and accessible to those that need it the most. And so this is I mean, again, this all sounds very straightforward from, you know, sitting here in my ivory tower and laying out these ethical principles. But when you start to talk about private sector service provision, and they're like, oh, well, we don't have the utilization, or it's not profitable, or, you know, I'm not really incentivized to go into that market, then this is where the tensions start to arise. So I'm not sure that I've fully answered your question, but I wanted to put that idea out there, at least for my fellow panelists, and see what they had to say about it.
Thank you, Tim. Linnet?
Thanks. So this is a super interesting question. I've been teaching technology ethics for a while, and the trolley problem always comes up when I teach computer scientists. They're very comfortable with the trolley problem and less comfortable with an ethics that includes politics usually. The ethics of data and the ethics of technology at the moment is going in two different directions. One, the more common one, is sort of a microethics of design and implementation that asks how you can take this given technology and do it better. And then there's a macroethics of, I guess you could say, public interest and public good, which asks what technology should do in the world and should do for the world. And these can go in radically different directions in really interesting ways. So I'm fascinated by the moral machine study because that's based, as Fran correctly says, on the trolley problem. And this offers this vision of individual empowerment. There's an individual designer making choices about the technology. The technology will kill or save based on choices of an individual. But this is not really how tech, and particularly transport tech, works in the world. It's developed on a group basis, it operates on a group basis, and it has its effects on a group basis way beyond whether it points at the nun or the child, you know, at a moment where things go wrong. So I guess I'm interested in expanding, or at least accompanying, this microethics with a macroethics as well that doesn't necessarily agree with the premise of the question, and that might answer, I don't think we should have a car. I think we should build a tram. Which I think was never an option in the moral machine. You have to get involved with the cars.
Thank you.
Can I ask Linnet a follow-up question?
Please.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that's really the way people make decisions, and but it's sort of close enough for sort of describing the kind of ethical problems that autonomous systems will have that it seemed to be very popular. And, you know, I think to myself, well, what I really want is, imagine I do buy a car and, you know, and it's self-driving. What I really, you know, would it make sense? You know, I sit down and take 100-question tests, and then the car has now learned my ethics, right? It's represented my ethics, and it learns over time, you know, what's important to me. I mean, are there realistic relative directions to think about, in your opinion, or do you think that you know, my ethics and your ethics and Tim's ethics, everybody's ethics, are really going to need to sort of be at the same level?
I think it depends what we mean by ethics. I think in the study of philosophical ethics, relativism is not a valid position. I'm not sure. I think this is a much longer discussion, probably. Relativism is not permissible in actual philosophical ethics.
Thank you. I want to, again, this is related to previous questions. What is the role of life experience, especially when compared to generational differences and familiarity with technology and the life? We definitely are living a different life than the new generation, people who were born Generation Z or whatever they're called. How does it impact the acceptance of new technology? And again, does it change if Linnet doesn't get unhappy? Does it change the standards of ethics, whatever we define ethics? I would like you to share your thoughts on the life experience and how it would shape the acceptance of different technologies. Please, Tim, if you'd like to start.
Sure. I mean, I can start with surface level observations. I wish I had some data to back this up, but it's easy to imagine that, you know, young people largely comprise early adopters, particularly of, you know, think of even social media as a good proxy for that. And they have very different values with regards to consent and privacy than you know, millennials or boomers, or you know, I forget the exact preferred demographic terms in between. But there will always be those early adopters that are willing to jump headfirst into a technology and become those tech evangelists, the yes in my backyard isms. You can see plenty of examples in the types of people that were quick to pick up, say, Tesla Autopilot, and then were very quick to post YouTube videos about it, and then videos of them getting in the back seats of their cars and all of this. Wonderful, wonderful examples to society. So yes, I mean, I'm sure I'm just teaching everybody to suck eggs at this stage, but it's easy to see that age and your you know, general background would definitely impact your willingness to accept such features, I guess. And how that translates to ethics, I mean, there may be that you may find that these early adopters are, again, willing to perhaps take more risks with regards to experiencing these, you know, automated transportation systems. But I don't know if that would, well, if there will be perhaps, well, I don't know if anybody, you know, I want to just put this out there with an example, actually. I don't know if anybody saw Upload, but they teased out an interesting idea where you could choose whether your vehicle would prioritize occupant safety over pedestrian safety. And as a, you know, as a bit of a nerd, when I saw that, I was like, ooh, and I started taking notes and watched how that, you know, played out in the plot. But that explores a very different and interesting idea. And we've only seen one example of a company kind of put their head over the parapet and say, no, of course, we're only going to prioritize an occupant's safety over those outside the vehicle, because why would you get in the vehicle otherwise? So I think there are some interesting dynamics to play out, I guess, as these things come to market. And yeah, I don't know, I'll defer to my other panelists to weigh in a little bit more informedly about that.
Thank you, Tim. Also, in the meanwhile, if you have a question, please post it in the chat area. We'll get to them. Fran, if you'd like to.
I think this is a great question, by the way, and this is a bit US-centric, so apologies for that, but I saw a study a couple of years ago by the Automobile Association of America. You know, for those of you in the US, you get your AAA card, and then if you're stuck on the road, you know, someone will come save you, I guess, I don't know. But they did a study on how people feel about self-driving cars. You know, do they trust them? And or almost self-driving cars. And it turned out that about 3/4 of the people did not. And that even when they looked at age demographics, they did not. So, you know, young people were like, you know, a little nervous about it, just like older people were a little nervous about it. You know, to me, you know, one of the sort of key underlying things to think about when you think about life experience is trust, right? Are you going to trust this autonomous device that you're talking with? And I think it does make a difference whether you were born in a world where there were always autonomous devices versus if you were born in a world that there were not. Two places to think about who trusts self-driving cars, right, are fatalities. You know, is it, am I more likely to be safe in a self-driving car than a human-driven car? And privacy of data. You know, is my data more likely to be private in a human-driven car that doesn't have a lot of self-driving capabilities versus something that's zipping up data, you know, as fast as it can in order to improve all kinds of things, and by the way, become more profitable and more intrusive. And so I do think you'll probably see some demographics there. An interesting statistic is that we actually have no idea if self-driving cars are safer, because of course you want the numerator to be number of, perhaps, if this is the way you measure it, number of fatalities over a particular time frame versus vehicle miles traveled over that same time frame. And we typically know that for human-driven cars. For self-driving cars, I believe there's only been at most a half a dozen fatalities, and we have no idea what vehicle miles travels are because people don't have to report. All the people experimenting on this don't have to report the data. So we can't compare, even if it was a little better, would that be enough? You know, does it have to be a lot better? Does it have to be like an airplane? And so I think there are lots of questions when you start digging in the details of how you assess these things and what different demographic groups think about them.
Thank you, Fran. Linnet, please.
Thanks. I'm looking at the chat and there's some really interesting comments there, by the way. Somebody called Graham just said, automation will not solve transport inequalities, it will just repackage them. And I was reflecting on that in light of what Tim and Fran were talking about, which I very much agree with. There are differences between younger and older people in how they encounter technology, in their beliefs about that technology, and in how they're prepared to engage with it. And that definitely counts for the sort of transport things that we're talking about as well. Research shows that young people are not less sensitive to privacy. They're actually very careful in how they curate their digital personas, in what they share and who they share it with. The difference between younger and older people, as far as research can tell, is that young people are resigned to being screwed over. They assume that digital technologies are profoundly exploitative, that they are formed entirely to profit at the expense of users, and they make a decision to engage with them anyway because they live in a world where they can't disengage as easily as we could. So I'm 47 and I grew up in a world without internet when I was a teenager, without having to use email, without a cell phone. And my daughters are not experiencing that world. Their school expects them to use Google. The country expects them to use a chip cart to travel, which records their every movement. Soon they'll have to carry a phone around if they want to know when their classes are canceled. And that phone will record everything they do. The idea that all of this is entirely voluntary and joyous for them, I am not convinced by that. The idea that this involves trusting the technology, I'm not really convinced by that either. I think trust is often mistaken for resignation. At least research, psychological behavioral research shows that the two are very close and often overlap. So I'm very intrigued by the idea of what people will and will not accept and what people do and don't want, because the premise has changed radically over the last generation. And I agree that we can't unroll the carpet that we have rolled out. And we probably don't want to. And as I said, I enjoy a lot of the technology that we have nowadays, and I think it's largely a very good thing. But the idea that people accept is a very thorny one for me, and I think we should be careful how we use that.
Thank you. I really like the resignation. So I study traffic safety, and studies show that there's a correlation between economic development and safety performance of different societies. And one of the theories is, well, when people know that they're in high risk, why do they still drive, or why do they expose themselves? And I believe resignation is one of the reasons that you don't have a choice in some level. That's how we can live. Thank you. I asked my, okay, we have a question from James. James asked, what makes the correlation between equality and ride sharing as opposed to accessibility, cost, or other factors so strong in your opinion? So what are correlation between equality and ride sharing is strong? If maybe Tim, you would like to answer, maybe? I'm asking you a different question. Huh?
I might defer to Linnet on that one actually, but let me come back to you.
If Linnet and Fran have any thoughts on that. So, so basically, I think it builds on what we said, that ride sharing doesn't necessarily mean, improvement of ride sharing doesn't necessarily lead to equality. And I think James' question is, what makes this correlation stronger? How can we make ride sharing more equal? I believe that's the question that James is asking. Andrew, you've been quiet. I'm sorry, I asked all the questions. If Linnet or Linnet, do you have a thought on that, or Fran?
I'm interested by the research. It's the first time I'm encountering it, so it seems a very rich vein of inquiry.
Thank you.
So, shall I? Can I jump in? I've just been loving the discussion. It's really good, and the observation that I'd like to make is, Fran originally pointed out that technology is neutral, which I think everybody kind of reiterated, and Tim also said that we should only have these systems where there's a positive risk balance, which you can refer to safety, but you could apply that term more broadly, where the benefit outweighs the costs, essentially. I think the tension here in the whole discussion is around the disparity between these hugely powerful global corporations who are developing these systems and the individuals who are kind of on the receiving end, and perhaps the societies in which they live being less able to resist them. And I think really a lot of the ethical issues stem from that, really. So it's nothing so much to do with the ethics of the operation. It's more the ethics of the system which is developing these solutions. So I just wondered whether to finish with, people might just want to kind of reflect back on that, which kind of reflects back on the overall question for the session.
I'm going to jump in here because I don't want you to think I think technology is neutral, because I don't. I'll tell you what I do think is neutral. I think math is neutral. I think the wonderful and beautiful and marvelous things about math is we set up any world we want, and then we can figure out inferences and conclusions in that world. And I think that all of the things that technologies are based on, most of them are math, but who writes the program, how we write the program, what training set we use for an artificial intelligence program, how we make things profitable, which priorities we promote and which priorities don't get promoted. I think all of those, come in the human context in creating technology. And so for me, I do think it's time we really focus much more on technology within the public interest. Our colleagues in Europe are at least experimenting with the General Data Protection Regulation, for example, which really thinks about sort of the human implications of technology. In the US, we're not as fortunate to have federal laws that do as much to protect our citizens. I think it's time that we really have to do that, because technology is marvelous, but it can't be that sort of innovation at all costs. It really has to be, at the end of the day, it has to be a great tool to promote our advancement as a civilization and as a society. And I think we need to have a lot more conversation in that area.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with Fran's statement there. I think the perspective that I see is, if we leave these tech providers to pursue solutions bounded only by the free market forces that exist, they are going to deliver fundamentally evil solutions, for want of a better term. And there are lots of examples of this in the gig economy, where they created these services and these platforms outside of regulation, and then regulators were kind of scrambling to keep up. So it is on, I would say, the general public and policymakers to think about how can these services be repositioned to serve a public good. And to my earlier comment, we should think about, if mobility is a human right, how can we incentivize the provision of mobility as a public good? And how can we partner and develop a policy environment that strongly incentivizes that over profit and growth at all costs?
So I agree with Fran and Tim on this, and to continue this line of thinking, there's never been any area where there's money to be made and power to be gained where the public interest didn't suffer. So one of the things this implies, which we haven't talked about, is how a central actor has to be the state. Right? Corporations don't get to determine how this works. Markets shouldn't get to determine how this works. And that's a very uncomfortable thing, because then we can't talk about a lot of technology provision, because technology providers will not be interested. If there's a control on profit, they will simply disappear and go do something else. I paid an awful lot of money to get into a smart cities conference a few years ago, and listened to one of the major tech companies in the world do a presentation where they said, so all of our smart city provision, you have to understand, like everybody involved in this sector, it's not actually in the public interest. It's a container that we create in order to pull ideas and data out of the city and to place them in other cities in the shape of other functions. So it's an extractive, the objective is entirely extractive. It's an extractive technology. And we all acknowledge that. And everyone in the room, like 100 people, nodded. So this is the environment in which we're operating. And the idea that we have meaningful democratic or regulatory traction over this is right now a bit of a fiction, because states and cities, municipal governments are so ecstatic to have big tech offer them free services where they pay with data, that they're welcoming them in. I don't see why this would change without the state, without states investing more in transport networks. And when they do that, then we will get meaningful discussion of what those transport networks should look like, and we will understand better the role that private actors can and should play in those to support those networks.
Fantastic. So I think we got to the end of our time. So I would really like to thank all of our three panelists today. We've had a really in-depth and interesting discussion. I've just been blown away with the quality of the argument. It's been fantastic. Hopefully everyone in the audience has enjoyed the discussion, and if you have, you might like to join our next roundtable, and I'm just going to be posting the link in the chat now. So on the 19th of November, it's always the third Thursday in the month. So on the 19th of November, the roundtable will meet again, and the topic will be mobility and safety. Is saving more lives worth the cost? So a bit of a provocative title again. As always, the time will be 12 o'clock in the US Eastern Time, 1700 in the UK, and 1800 in Central Europe. We've checked based on the daylight saving changes that are about to happen, and we believe the time should still be the same in November. So thank you very much to Linnet, Fran and Tim for your contributions. Thanks Mojtaba for organizing it, and thank you to the audience for attending. The recording will be available in a few days' time if you'd like to download that, and I'll leave it to Mojtaba to say goodbye.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. It was excellent, very insightful, and we hope we can continue the communication and the conversation. Thank you for your time.